The United States government gave profuse amount of money during the Cold War to fund this, hoping that they will learn and crack down the Soviet secrets. Like this entire neighborhood, there is like a screenwriter in every window writing something, right?
How does first immigrants find themselves in the cultural space in America coming from the regions that historically had geopolitical tension with United States?
It's very difficult to be an artist in the United States in general. People were just fascinated with this whole, downfall of the royalty and the poor princesses. And they settled in Hollywood right next to the film studios.
Hi guys, I'm Misha Suvorov, an actor and DeepARTment with double E founder.
Misha Suvorov is a trained actor from the City of Theaters, St. Petersburg, Russia, and a human rights activist. He's established a DeepARTment nonprofit helping underrepresented artists thrive, with a focus on fresh creative immigrants. Coming from an artsy Soviet intelligentsia family, he enjoyed a privilege of having the best of what late Soviet era of underground arts could offer. Misha Suvorov works on stage, TV, and in film. Misha undertook Konstantin Stanislavski's method of acting. In 2013, Misha arrived at Hollywood, where he studied at the Sanford Meisner Center of Los Angeles to learn the American way of acting. In 2024, his solo acting stage performance, The Border, won the Best of the Actors Group during the Hollywood Fringe Festival.
And today we're here with Sasha Razor. Sasha, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Misha. So I'm a lecturer at UC Santa Barbara, and I have an affiliation with two departments over there, Germanic and Slavic, and Film and Media Studies.
Sasha Razor is a lecturer in German and Slavic Studies, also Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. She earned her PhD in Slavic languages and literature from UCLA in 2020, with a dissertation focused on Soviet screenwriting in the 1920s and 1930s. Her research interests include avant-garde cinema and literature, Belarusian and Ukrainian culture.
There is so many film schools, like within the 10-mile radius, there is at least like five, there's NIFA, AFI, there is a Los Angeles Film School, there is UC, UCLA, why Santa Barbara?
Well, you see, my PhD is in Slavic studies and not film studies. And for Slavics, there are only so many jobs in the United States. So the first job that I got was in Santa Barbara, and it just worked out this way that I could work in both departments there. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. You've mentioned Slavic and Germanic studies, and you've mentioned cinematographers. So which area? Like it sounds like two different disciplines. How do they merge?
Let me explain this, because it's not really obvious to people outside the field. So Slavic studies is a weird thing. It's a discipline which emerged in the United States during the Cold War, when Americans suddenly had to learn about the Soviet Union and Russian and train the diplomats and the spies and intelligence. So it's a very multidisciplinary field which encompasses a number of areas, but of course in the United States it's all really based on the study of language and literature. This is what dominates, So the United States government gave profuse amount of money during the Cold War to fund this, hoping that they will learn and crack down the Soviet secrets, what have you. And my colleagues instead, they fell in love with Tolstoy and Pushkin and Dostoevsky, and they're still there, studying this stuff. But it gives a lot of flexibility. And once I came to Hollywood, I settled in Laurel Canyon, surrounded by filmmakers, as you understand, like this entire neighborhood. There is like a screenwriter in every window writing something, right? So I wanted to work on the avant-garde because that's what I like, the 1920s, but also I wanted to work on screenwriting, and I wrote my dissertation on this very new interdisciplinary field, screenwriting studies, and this is what made it possible for me to start working in a film school. And then once I started, I do prefer to teach in the artists because it's always fun and very dynamic.
Yeah, no, this is a very vibrant community indeed.
Yeah, and then Belarus, because I'm from Belarus, I come from the contemporary art community and have so many friends who are artists that I do write about them sometimes just to help out. I would curate an exhibition every once in a while, but I do it as a side gig very much.
Okay, so do you still connected to the modern contemporary Belarusian
Absolutely,
culture?
absolutely. And I'm doing a large project tracking artistic migration from the region and in touch with all my friends from Minsk and other cities.
Do you mean forced migration or voluntary?
Forced migration, but I do view it a bit wider. I look at migration of different waves because many people came way earlier. So for me, it's about generally migration from the former Russian Empire and the Soviet and post-Soviet region, and unlike just forced migration, which is happening for the past 5 years now, 4 years.
You've mentioned like immigrant art. So when we talk about post-Soviet immigrants, it's rather a difficult situation, don't you find, in terms of how does forced immigrants find themselves in the cultural space in America, coming from the regions that historically had geopolitical tension with United States?
So I can say that name me one country where it's ever been easy for the artist. That's not what art or being an artist is about, but some countries are more conducive to art practices than others. And in the United States, we have very little government funding for the public arts and fine arts. I mean, that was certainly the case with the Roosevelt era and the Great Depression, but after that, not as much. So it's very difficult to be an artist in the United States in general. It's much easier to be an artist in Europe, where they have profuse amount of grants and support and the galleries, and it's a different system. So they come from, this very difficult circumstances, very little capital that they can bring with them. And they enter the scene in which the galleries can sometimes charge you money to participate in the exhibition and don't quite know how to navigate it. So it's not easy, but I have to say that many Russian artists came here way before in the 1920s and had such quite successful careers.
Back then, were Russian-speaking immigrants more accepted than the immigrants that came after the downfall of Soviet Union and during the current geopolitical tensions?
So it depends which era do we talk about. The first wave of migration happens in the second part of the 1920s, but it was the so-called Russian Hollywood colony. But it wasn't a very large group. It was really 1,300 people, that's all. And Americans at the time were quite fascinated with the aristocratic background that many had or faked it. Many came from humble background, but then they, pretended to be aristocrats and made up their biographies. That happened quite a lot, actually. And people were just fascinated with this whole, downfall of the royalty and the poor princesses now touring, giving book tours, which they did. The Romanovs, the Romanov family, think about them. They were very artistic too, and right now there are descendants of the Romanovs who are artists and participate in exhibitions. So all of that took place, but it wasn't easy for them either, and I would actually say it was much more difficult because they were threatened with death, and many were killed, and migration took place under very enduring circumstances, and those were the people who lost everything. So compared to people who come from Russia today, I would say that it was way worse, much worse. For this group, and yet they somehow persevered, and many had very successful career for the artists, but the secret was as such. Hollywood back then, it was still, at the early stages of its formation, and they settled in Hollywood right next to the film studios. Okay, so one of the most successful artists, they also worked in the film industry and they worked on sets. For example, Prince Golitsyn won many Oscar awards for his set design. Yeah.
I did not know that.
So and right now, you guys come and you think Hollywood, but the market is not the same and the industry is not the same.
It's very comforting to hear that things are better now for ex-USSR republics, immigrants. People who come from places like Belarus, like Russia, they come from like effectively very tough censorship right now that's happening in that region. So how does it affect an artist like being lived and having upbringing in the society that is way more censored and not liberated through art and through like societal religion?
The question is about censorship.
Yeah, how does it affect an artist? So coming from this censored environment to effective freedom of expression, of self-expression, how like do you see any difficulties there for people to liberate themselves from arts or find themselves through the like self-expression?
So I would say there are a couple of things here to consider. First of all, I wouldn't equate Russia and Belarus because very different countries, different art education system, very different opportunities that people have in these spaces, because Russia has some form of contemporary art in terms of Belarus, where I'm from, is quite different because there is not one single institution that teaches you contemporary art at all, like including the Academy of Art. And for a long time, we just had one gallery for the entire country that worked with the artists, operating with literally next to none budget, like non-existent budgets. There was no system of grants to participate in or anything. So everything that Belarusians have, it's a very like horizontal practice of working together, educating each other, doing the things truly out of nowhere. And in a way, Belarusian artists who had to leave the country because they would have been arrested otherwise, or they already were arrested and served their time in jail and had to leave because to avoid the second arrest, which would have come with a longer sentence. They are doing much better in Europe. Many of them settled in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Berlin than they were doing in Belarus. And right now we are experiencing a true explosion of Belarusian contemporary art. In the US, it's a different story, and it's very difficult to do the same level of work here because it needs to come with funding and being integrated in the art structures. When it comes to Russian artists, the situation is somewhat different because Russians as a group are very much recognized in the West, and this has to do with the way that the Slavic departments, my training, the program I come from, produce the knowledge about the region. For a very long time it has been Russocentric, and people who love Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Tolstoy, they also love the artists from the region. So if someone, you say like, hi, I'm an nonconformist artist from St. Petersburg, this will open many doors for you, right? And unfortunately, it's good for the Russian art, and but it's a situation which creates representational discrepancy.
You mean in terms of inequality?
What do you mean by I would say that it's much easier to do a project for a Russian artist coming from the region and say that I flee the persecution, oppression, and the war, than coming from a minor culture like Belarusian, where we don't even have one program that teaches Belarusian language in the US. Like, people wouldn't know what to do with you. Then the question comes, do I want to identify as a Russian artist in exile, or do I want to be just an artist, or do I want to be just a human being, or do I want to credit America as my host country and be Russian-American artist, or do I not want this national context to determine myself? And this is the biggest question that the artists are resolving individually.
Yeah, and my question really has like so many layers, and I want to focus like on several of them because it's really important. I feel you've mentioned that artists living and operating under censorship regimes, authoritarian regimes, they are kind of pushed into be political. So like real conceptual art under authoritarian regime has to be political in one way or another because like basic freedoms are so severely violated. And then all of a sudden they get into this environment when there is not much to fight against in terms of like limitations of freedom of speech, and it's a free world. And they like all of a sudden found themselves with no political agenda anymore. So, and some of them kind of reinvented themselves in this like new environment, and the others, they just, dissolved because like the thing they were fighting against their entire life.
How do artists who grew up in these authoritarian societies with a degree of censorship experience the art conditions in the West? And I think that this is a great question. It's a very interesting question, Misha, because on one hand, you would think that, okay, the artist is very limited and you can say this, but you cannot say that. But on the other hand, look at the art which comes from St. Petersburg, especially the public art, especially all those beautiful graffiti and installations, all of that. I wouldn't call these people unfree. And if you look at the art genealogy at the time, the traditions of Moscow Romantic conceptualism, something like Dmitry Prigov, the tradition of the earlier layers of Russian culture, such as Soviet avant-garde, with its own very strong impulse to kind of decenter and maybe like even work with conceptual frames and discourses, it gives people very kind of like hyper-awareness of what propaganda is, what the speech cliches are, and how to work with it in a conceptual way. So I do not think that censorship is necessarily an impediment for the free expression. Artists find the ways to express themselves. But what is a big impediment to them is the politicized environment that they live in. What if they just want to create pure art and be apolitical? There is art like that. There are all sorts of artists, but if you're an artist in Russia, it's also a social construct that you have some kind of like social burden to speak the truth, to express yourself through art, and to show people how to, in a way, instruct them.
Both of our guests will be honored jury members of the upcoming International Slavic Film Festival, which will take place for the first time in downtown Los Angeles on October 4th, 2025. As part of our Art with an Accent program, Speaking Creation is curating a public panel titled Translating Cultural Codes, the Slavic Filmmakers in a Hollywood Frame. The event will bring together directors of Slavic origin who are working in a transitioning into Hollywood, the land of high-end concepts, fast cut, and test audience endings. Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more meaningful art events and follow the link in the description to book your participation.
We touched a little bit on immigrant art, and we touched a little bit on anti-war protest politicized art. So like trying to combine the two. So artists forced into migration from occupied communities or otherwise just like living the oppression of authoritarian regimes and censorship, this anti-war sentiment is very loud and it's hard to avoid it. So like by say like Russian speaking American artists, it's hard to avoid this narrative. And when you do things like that, I don't think immigrant art ever like existed in quite such circumstance where like if you have any family left at home, say like when I was making my decision on staging and producing the anti-war Russian solo show here in the United States of America, and then later doing Art Against War Festival, my family back home is a big consideration because they can be oppressed because of me.
Does Russian government effectively track people who declare anti-war statements on social media?
Yes. Yeah, you can get like 8 years of jail time for anti-war posts on social media, for like one single anti-war post.
How does that work?
Face recognition. They have like Patriot software that, like if you go back home, they stop you on the border. They take your devices.
Well, yeah. I mean, so the ground rule is that you should have no plans of returning home if you want to do political art.
Yes, and that's disclaimer.
And that this is the same for the Belarusian community. Like once you are out and loud and do not protect your face and identity. But I wanted to go back to something else. So one more thing that I see happening to the artists who migrate today, and it doesn't matter whether they come from Russia, Belarus, or Ukrainian, displaced artists from Ukraine. In Europe, the only way for the artists to continue to work is to go through art residency system. And it has its own limitations because many people do not know where they will be next. And sometimes they will change, 8 to 10 countries a year. 20 apartments a year, and it's always like short-term gigs. And based on the many interviews that I conducted with people, they really cannot create in these conditions because you constantly write another grant and have to do something and do something. So many people in the first 2 years ran on their old ideas and were finishing their older projects or like archiving their stuff. But then the time comes when they say, look, I cannot sustain this. I cannot do this any longer. They cannot legalize in Europe because migration process to the United States is much easier, believe me or not. And in Europe, it just sometimes they would have children born in the country and still none of them are citizens, etc., etc. So many of them decide that, okay, this is time for me to stop jumping from residence to residence and actually do something which will give me solid income. And many of them are entering schools and try to study, do MFA programs, enhance their skills, or drop out of this art circuit completely and actually make money, which is also, you cannot blame them for that. But with this creative migration come new opportunities, but also difficult circumstances which would not be conducive to producing art in the future.
Yeah, I agree. Like financial insecurity is the whole set of another problems, which I just want to leave out of equation for now, because I really want to stay a little bit on this situation, because I don't think we quite ever had it before, because world was never so integrated and globalized. So say, even in the 70s, the first waves of Russian Jewish immigration who would like so-called jump over the fence and migrate to United States, they were pretty liberated at this point. So once you cross the border and you land yourself like in Los Angeles, yes, the financial insecurity, like migration problems and all of that, but you can create your art and you can perform without this idea in the back of your mind that you're going to face the repression or your family going to face the repression, like Baryshnikov, like Oleg Videv. They were pretty much like secure and free.
So you're mentioning really high-profile performance arts people, Videv an actor, Baryshnikov a ballet dancer. But I would say that no, the old KGB methods were such that the families were persecuted.
They would go after.
Yes, and they would go after the families. There are many cases like that known to us. And even something like a publication of something in the West, if you were staying in the Soviet Union, that was very dangerous to do. But the reason why they did all of that is because the assumption was that they can never travel back. The people who were living Soviet Union at the time, they were living forever. They were saying goodbye forever to their family and friends and going into the unknown.
Please subscribe to our channel. It will help to bring more of a thoughtful creation into your life.
Just the last question to wrap up on our conversation. Identity oppression. We just off camera, we talked about Russian-speaking advisory board of West Hollywood, and I've heard some voices that want to rename it to like Slavic-speaking Eastern European advisory board. We know the Russian Culture Festival that had to be renamed ever since the beginning of the war. And I know that the Victory Day, the 9th of May, traditional Victory Day for ex-USSR republics, also has a lot of tension around it, and they want to abolish it. And I'm not necessarily against all of that, and I understand that Russia causes some trauma to some other nations right now. But as the Russian American, when you operate again in the space where you feel this identity oppression in a way that you're accepted by American society, but you kind of like swept under the carpet because you don't come out with your like Russian anti-war statements. Like anything Russian is a little bit like toxic or weird or it's in a gray area, the way I feel it. So my question to you is, how do you first of all, would you agree that this exists right now in American society? And secondly, if you do agree, what is the way to overcome and negate this possible Russian toxicity?
So let me phrase it very carefully, because I do see these things on the other end as administrators, the person who makes programming decisions sometimes, as the person who decides who gets to present and who gets to perform and how we would brand a program or label it and what's going in. What is the back end of all that? And I do think that the stigma in some cases is self-perceived, and people, given the very recent kind of experience with the war, have a lot of self identity crisis and want to rename themselves. And American society, especially people who are not familiar with Russia, like American students whom I teach in the classrooms, they could care less. That war is really far away from them, and the reason why they come to study Russian language with me is because they're like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, chess, matryoshki, samovars, and cheburashka. And nothing can kill this love, nothing can kill this love. So I do, and I actually take it upon myself to educate them and say that we're responsible for the knowledge we produce in this time and place. And we want to be inclusive because Russia is far away, and in my classroom I can have a kid from Ukraine, a kid from Russia, a kid who came from Israel but the parents speak Russian, Muslim kids from Kazakhstan, and we all belong, and this is the space of America. And in Europe, identity politics is quite different, and they have very tense conflicts over there. But when we look at the funding and the amount of funding allocated to Russians in Europe, Russian projects, Russian culture, I don't see a problem there. I don't see a problem there. Ukrainians receive a lot of fundings, but so do Russians. Marat Gelman could open his gallery right on, like big alley in Berlin, and it works. Belarusians are the one who fell between the cracks quite a bit because they don't qualify for anything anymore. But in the United States, it's a question of not just one identity, but competing migration narratives. People who came here from the Soviet Union in the 1990s have nothing to do with Putin's Russia. They don't relate culturally, they don't understand the dynamics. They live in the cultural paradigm from the 1980s and 70s that they brought here and come with a different set of questions. One thing that I recently remarked, which might give you some optimism, is that Los Angeles perhaps is the last space where people speak Russian to each other freely, because it's not like if I spoke to my friends for the past 20 years in Russian, I would just go cold turkey on them and be like, no, you now have to speak English with me. No. It's just I have one extra language, two extra languages at my disposal. I also think that if you are to think about, I don't know if you're familiar with decolonial theory or kind of like decolonizing the narrative, you have to free your mind, but also free the design. So get rid of the ideology and the propaganda, but there is nothing shameful in speaking Russian language, in being who you are, in being a part of your culture, as long as your culture doesn't kill other cultures or people. Yeah?
Thank you, Sasha. It was very interesting, deep, insightful conversation. It gives me hope. Maybe last word of wisdom to migrating artists, blending their identity, their national origin with their new national identity, like Russian-speaking Americans, Belarusian Americans, and others. I don't know, anything you want to tell them?
So I think art is one space which problematizes identities and doesn't reinforce them naturally. So what is identity? Who are you as a human being is much more important than all the framework that you use to put your art out there, right? So look for your true self and do what you love.
Thank you.
Please subscribe to our channel. It will help to bring more of a thoughtful creation into your life.